This is one of the most interesting lenses I've ever been sent. In fact, I've never seen a lens quite like it. It's actually the smallest full frame lens that I've ever seen. I don't know if there is a smaller one that even exists, but it couldn't get much smaller than this and cover a full frame. Now, just to give you a comparison, prior to receiving this little lens, this little full frame lens, the smallest full frame lenses I've ever used were this one, which is the Canon 40mm f2.8, and you can see the size difference there. And this one, the Zhongyi 20mm f5.6, and you can see the size difference there. Now, interestingly, this lens is a 28mm f2.8. So when we compare it to the Zhongyi, it's actually smaller and has a wider maximum aperture. So it's got that going for it. In full disclosure, this lens was sent out to me for the purpose of making this video, but all opinions are my own, and this is not a paid or sponsored video. And for current pricing and availability on the lens, I have left some links in the description down below. Now, when you look at the lens, you can see that the focus of making this lens was to make a lens that is as small as possible. And this one is absolutely tiny. And in fact, to achieve that, what you'll see is beyond the lens mount, the actual optics of the lens sit within the camera body itself. So if you actually look at the width of the entire lens, probably as much as 2/3 of it are actually sitting inside the camera body. In addition to that, this is still a reasonably sophisticated lens. It's a 6-element lens in 5 groups. And when I look at this, I wonder where the heck they fit the 5 groups. I mean, I can imagine the 6 elements, but how on earth are they sitting in 5 groups? But anyways, this is what they've got. And if you look, it's got quite a small front element, but the rear element is actually quite big, which is often good for vignette performance. The bigger rear elements often allow a bit more light to hit the sensor, and it's that rear element that often limits you as far as the light hitting the sensor and the vignette. And we'll talk about that later in the video and how that actually plays out. And the other thing that I notice about this lens for its size is how heavy it is. It's only about 10 grams lighter than both the Canon lens or the Zhongyi lens. And you can see it's still much, much smaller. So those other 2 lenses are around 125 grams, and this lens is 115 or thereabouts. And that's because the entire lens body is made of brass, which is fairly unusual nowadays. So this lens is built sort of like the old vintage lenses would have been built, and they certainly haven't spared you on quality. When you take this thing out of the box, it does feel like an incredibly high quality lens just because it's so dense. It really is a fascinating little thing. And essentially, this is what they would call a body cap lens. It's a lens designed to be put on the camera in place of a body cap, but it's also a lens. And with that comes a few little interesting fiddly things. The first thing is this is the lens cap, which you have to screw on, which took me a little bit of time to actually get used to. But now that I'm used to it, it's not too bad. But you're not going to be taking that thing on and off quickly. And I wouldn't want to do it sort of in a run and gun situation. You might end up dropping it. So that is a little bit of a fiddly thing. The other thing is if we look at the front of the lens, it is an all manual focus, manual aperture lens. So we have to have a focus ring and an aperture ring on here. And the way they've done it is really interesting. So this is your aperture ring. This little thing here that you push around is your aperture ring. So it's not even a traditional ring, which is on the outside. It's on the front of the lens. Now, this hasn't bothered me too much because I usually shoot the thing at f2.8 or f5.6. So I kind of just set it and forget it. And then your focus, once again, there's not really room for a focus ring. So what you've got is a focus lever that just sticks out the side, and that allows you to focus. And actually, both the aperture ring and the focus ring are reasonably smooth, and they're quite nice to use. I was afraid that it was going to be challenging to find focus with this little lever, but it wasn't too bad. It's pretty well damped, and it's got a decent throw to it. So it actually does work quite well, and I didn't find myself hunting for focus like I do on some manual lenses. The other thing to know is this lens is on the M mount, which if I'm looking for manual lenses and it's available on M mount, I get it on the M mount every time. And that's because 1, you can adapt it to all the different mirrorless mounts right now. But 2, the flange distance to adapt this is very, very shallow. So this is a mount, this is going to Sony E mount. And as you can see, the adapter is not very thick. It almost is just the thickness of a very small focus ring. This is different than sort of EF mount, or F mount, because those lenses were designed to work in cameras that had the full mirror assembly behind them for mirrored cameras, which means that your adapter is much, much bigger. So this is a mirrorless mount that you can adapt to any mirrorless camera, but you get the smallest possible adapter, making it feel more like a native mount on that camera. So recently, when I've been purchasing lenses or when manufacturers have been offering to send lenses out to me, if there is an M mount, that's what I order. And this lens mount actually dates back to 1954 when it was first released, and it's a Leica mount, and it's still being made to this day. So you can get a camera and a lens that was released in 1954, and you can use that combination, but you can use that lens on a modern M mount camera, a modern M mount digital camera. And it's the only lens mount that is a historic lens mount that's currently being implemented and used on a mirrorless camera that I know of, at least in the mainstream. There might be some other obscure stuff out there, but it's the only mainstream one where you can get these old lenses and you got the exact same mount on those cameras as you do with the mirrorless cameras. And being a 28mm f2.8 lens, this is just a fantastic documentary walk around, sort of do everything type lens. So it'd be a great street photography lens. It'd be a great family travel lens. It's so small that it's something that you could throw in your bag and not think about it. It's something that with a lot of these cameras would make them borderline pocketable or easily to fit in your purse. In fact, when I've walked out the door with this lens on my camera, I, on a number of occasions, have had people say to me, "Oh, you forgot your lens," which is kind of funny because that is the point of a lens like this. It basically takes up the same space as a body cap on your camera. Now, when you set out to make a lens this small, what are you sacrificing as far as the optical performance of the lens? And that's really what I was interested in. How bad is this lens going to be? And the fact is, it's actually surprisingly good, particularly in the center of frame. So I thought sharpness is where this thing was going to suffer big time. And in the center of the frame, probably all the way to about 2/3 or 3/4 to the edge and the sides, it is extremely sharp. I mean, sharp like a modern mirrorless camera lens would be. I was extremely surprised by this. It's even sharp at f2.8. You don't even have to stop it down to get a sharp image. Now, where this lens is interesting and falls short if we're looking at optical perfection is the fact that it has what's called a field curvature when it comes to focusing. And essentially what happens is if you're focusing on the center of the image with this lens, you've got a sharp and detailed image. But by the time you get to the corners, it isn't actually focusing at that distance anymore. So the center of the image is sharp, but once you get to the very edges and the corners, they're actually out of focus, even though they're the same distance from the camera than the thing in the center of the frame is. So the corners are always out of focus. Now, if you choose to actually intentionally put something at the corner of the frame and focus on that, it's actually sharp and in focus and reasonably good, but then the center of the frame is out of focus. So you get this really interesting effect, which is not considered generally desirable, but is a real thing. And that's where the center of your image is in focus and the edges and the corners are out of focus, which really draws the viewer's eye and your attention to whatever you put in the center of frame. Now, there's also a funny side effect that comes with this, is because at the corner, you are now focused on sort of a different plane of focus compared to the center. You will often get a situation where the person in the center of frame or whatever your subject is in focus. But by the time you get to the corners or the edges, that actual plane of focus has shifted so much that there's some other object that's in the background that's actually in focus, which creates a really strange look at times. And sometimes it's super interesting and sometimes it's distracting, but certainly it's not generally considered a desirable optical trait. But it is probably the single biggest sacrifice I see in this lens is this field curvature performance. Looking at the colors are great. They're super punchy. It doesn't give me this sort of totally vintage lens vibe. It's quite a modern, punchy, contrasty look. So I was quite impressed with that. And I also found the bokeh to be very soft and desirable and nice. You know, has kind of a vintage sort of flair or feel to it. And really, it does form a nice backdrop for whatever is in focus in the center of frame. The one thing you do get with this sort of weird bokeh effect is when you've got the thing in the center of frame, it's in focus, and the area immediately around it is out of focus and looks nice and soft. But then you've got a corner frame, depending on what's there and what distance is, that's all of a sudden in focus. So it is kind of a strange effect that doesn't always work, and that just all relates back to this field curvature performance. There is a slight amount of barrel distortion with this lens, but nothing that's not easily correctable in editing. It's quite consistent across the frame. I thought this performance would be much worse than it is, but it's actually not bad. All the photos that I'm showing and all the examples I'm showing you, I have not corrected in editing, just to give you a real look at what it looks like. So I think you can shoot this right out of camera and use it. But if you do want to correct that sort of curvature or that barrel distortion, it's quite easy to do in editing. The other thing that I was surprised that isn't an issue is the chromatic aberration. There really exhibited very little to no chromatic aberration, certainly nothing that I even felt the need to correct. There might be a slight bit of fringing at sort of out of focus areas in the background, but I mean, you really have to look for it, and certainly nothing that I think distracts from the quality of the photos. And I think the performance, as far as chromatic aberration goes, is sort of reasonably clinical. The one place that you will notice some sort of undesirable optical traits is vignette, which I do expect with a lens of this size. Now, it is better than a lot of other lenses, so it's actually surprisingly good, and I think a lot of that relates to this sort of huge rear element, but there definitely is vignette. Once again, it's very consistent, it's easy to correct if you want to, but I kind of don't mind leaving that vignette in there because the vignette helps cover up that sort of weird focusing curvature thing going on. So by leaving the vignette in, you've kind of darkened those areas that have this weird field curvature focus performance. And I think those two things actually work quite well together. And once again, I haven't corrected the vignette in any of the sample photos you're seeing. That's just the vignette and the way it comes out of camera. And ultimately, I have to ask, who is this lens for? Well, first of all, if you're an M-mount camera owner and you want a body cap lens, right now, this is the cheapest option and one of the best performing options for a 28mm f2.8. So I think if you're an M-mount owner, when you look at the price of other M-mount lenses, this thing is so much better than those. The other thing I would say is if you're looking for something totally new, unique, you kind of like to collect sort of cool and special objects, this is really a beautiful little piece of equipment. It's a great little talking point, and just using it is a challenge, but when you get things right, it's actually quite rewarding. So I could recommend it to sort of use on any mirrorless camera for somebody that's just looking for something a bit new and a bit challenging, but it's certainly not the second, third, or even fourth lens I would buy for a mirrorless camera. It's sort of way down the track when you're a bit bored and you want to kind of shake up your creativity and really do something new or make your camera a much smaller form factor. Now, this lens is by a company called Brightin Star, and if you haven't heard of Brightin Star before, you probably will in the coming years because they are producing some incredibly high quality lenses for very reasonable price points. And I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is the first lens of theirs that I ever tested. And essentially it's a lens that costs under $400 and has performance that's very, very similar to a $13,000 lens, making it one of the best budget lens buys of all time.